the focus of my work is very much on grading and reporting. And so I think obviously now is the time that we have to start thinking about what's it going to look like after the pandemic. And the first thing I think we have to be really clear about is that this is a crisis and that it's created all sorts of difficulties. And some of these are going to be very difficult to overcome. Clearly, it's a health crisis. Over 110,000 deaths now in the US, over 400,000 deaths worldwide. The economy is in free fall. Unemployment is at the highest levels that it's been since the Great Depression. There are lots of people who are having trouble with staying at home, with isolation, with social distancing. I mean, some of that has political, but whether it's political or not, it's creating huge difficulties. And part of that difficulty is because of the uncertainty. How long is it going to go on for? And that has led to unrest around the pandemic. But now we also have the protests, the systemic racism concerns, which of course are huge. And so we have this whole combination of things that really has created a huge crisis. And that in education, as Joe said, part of that crisis was because of the sudden shutdown of the schools. And we didn't know for how long. Was it for the rest of the school year? Was it into the next year? And this put great pressure on teachers, both 3 months ago and now. And I think this survey that was reported in ASCD Smart Brief really summed it up well, that the rapid transition during the closures affected teachers and students, with the majority of teachers saying they're somewhat or extremely uncertain, stressed, anxious, overwhelmed, and lonely. It's really important that we consider that context. And it's also put huge student pressure on students then and now. And there's obviously been real issues in terms of internet availability and device access in the virtual world. And we don't know how long that is going to continue. How have we generally in education responded to the crisis? We responded with online learning, we responded with packets, we responded with recommended hours for different grade levels. Different schools, different school districts did all sorts of things to try and make sure that as many students as possible had internet access. And then I think one of the things that became very clear, and it relates very much to some of the things that Joe said, that we have a really important order of operations in the online learning, that we had to start with connection, with understanding the basic needs of students. And we had to do that before the relationships could be built or renewed. And only after that could we have engagement and concern with the equity. And only after that could we have learning, whether it was digging into what we'd done or new learning. And when we were in that learning phase, we had to really focus on feedback and communicating clearly with students and with parents. And I think this, hopefully, would have always been our order of operations. But this situation has made it very clear that we need this to be our order of operations. One of the very first things that came out in the response was, what do we do about grades? And there was much angst about this. And in many places, there was a move to simplify, to say all the grades are pass or incomplete. But there are some problems with that. Is that the way we should continue? And then there've been issues about how much of what we're doing should be asynchronous or synchronous. It's been especially an issue where I live in Toronto, Canada. And there's also been an explosion of information, of blogs, of webinars, on Facebook learning groups, on Twitter chats, and of online publications. We've been bombarded with information. But I think that, to me, the main things that have come out is that less is more, that we've got to be more focused, that we have to be flexible because of all the different circumstances, that we have to have empathy to recognize different situations, and that above all, we need equity. So these are things that we have to recognize as the context for anything that we're going to do. And I think a good way to think about what we're doing and what we're going to do is the stop, start, continue idea, but always with purpose in mind. So where are we? Where do we want to go? Now, of course, which of stop, start, continue applies depending on where you're already at. And so my stop, start, continue is based on my perception of the common state. Now, so something that I say stop might be something that you're not doing, so that doesn't apply to you. But in this context of stop, start, continue, I really like the idea of this quote, and I don't know where it came from, but never let a good crisis go to waste. Let's make sure that things are different on the other side. I think we have the potential for a real silver lining coming out of this crisis. And so what are the things we need to continue generally, and maybe for some people start? The recognition of the critical role of relationships for engagement, for learning, the critical role of equity, empathy, and flexibility. Grace before grades is a phrase that I've heard over and over again, that, you know, grades are not our most important thing. We have to understand our learners, and that there is all sorts of opportunities for collaboration. I mean, how many times have we heard words like stronger together? And I think part of it has been the understanding that we need to focus on what's important, that generally we try to do too much. And I think there's also been an understanding about the critical role of feedback. But I think a really interesting part of that has been that there's been a recognition that not only do we need to give feedback, but we need to ask for feedback, especially from students. And that we also need to provide opportunities for students to self-assess, reflect, and goal setting. This has been very obvious in the virtual learning situation because we don't have them with us in an in-person setting. Now, the equity piece, this is a new one for me. I'm sure many of you have seen the baseball example, but this is a new one for me, but I really think it showed it very well in slightly different ways, moving from inequality to equality to equity to justice. So what should we stop doing? And again, this assumes that they're things that you've been doing. And again, because they're very common practices. I think we have to stop having percentage grades and along with percentages zeros, because clearly in this situation where it was difficult to get evidence of student achievement, the idea that we could identify 101 levels was ridiculous. We need to stop averaging, because that's not what learning's about. That it's not about what's the average of all of things. It's really about, when we make judgments of student achievement, where are we now? We have to stop any sort of penalties for behaviors in grades, for late submission of assessment evidence, of her academic dishonesty. Made no sense in the virtual learning situation, and it doesn't make sense in whatever we're in. Another one that I've heard a lot, and that's been an issue during the online learning, is for schools and school districts to require a certain number of marks per week. It's never made sense, but it certainly didn't work in virtual learning. It doesn't work when we're in brick and mortar schools. So it's something that should be stopped. And another thing I think that's become very clear is that words matter. And one word that really matters is the word work. And that's been particularly clear in this virtual situation. Students aren't working, they're learning, they're doing, they're making, they're demonstrating learning. And I think if we change our language to that, it really changes the whole context of assessment and grading. So what are some things that should be, for some people, continued, for others continued? And that is, the first one is identifying very clearly what are our priority standards. I know lots of school districts have done this, but the pandemic has made this even clearer. And Matt Townsley was the person that I think came up with this idea of pandemic priority standards. What are the standards that have endurance, that are important from a readiness to get students ready for the next level, and have leverage, help with transfer, help with higher order thinking? We need to start, if we're not already doing it, to have grades based on 2 to 7 levels of proficiency, not anything greater than that, because we can't have any real meaning to more than 2 to 7 levels. And we should be focused on standards, not method of assessment. We shouldn't be using points and percentages. And if we use, say, whatever number of levels we use, it's very important that we can emphasize the idea of learning over time. So the lowest level isn't you're hopeless. I'm obviously being a little facetious, but it's not yet incomplete. Learning is an ongoing process. And that the way to determine grades is to see what is the mode, what is the more recent level of performance, and then apply professional judgment. And please notice that what I said there, grades are determined. Grades should be determined. They shouldn't be calculated. Another thing that we need to start doing more of or continue is much greater student voice and choice, student agency, the use of passion projects, of problem-based learning, of digital portfolios. And what goes along with that is the emphasis on words, not symbols. What helps us get better is words, not symbols. And I think this connects with the idea of a more holistic evaluative view of student achievement, that we should be looking at the whole picture of student achievement. Primarily, we look at summative assessment evidence, but we need to consider the whole body of evidence. There have been lots of issues where students haven't been engaging, and people say, well, it's because we stopped giving grades and because they knew their grade. That should never have been the motivation. The motivation for students shouldn't be their grades. The motivation should be learning. So we need to maximize intrinsic motivation and minimize extrinsic motivation. And in a very specific aspect of assessment, we need to make more use of conversation as assessment evidence. And I think many teachers have found that in this situation because they haven't been able to get as much of the other type of evidence. You know, we have three basic types of evidence: conversation, observation, and products. They're all really good sources of evidence. We tend, especially at middle school and high school, to emphasize the product evidence, and we should be more emphasizing the conversation evidence. What are some other things that I think we should continue or start? And these are maybe a little bit more radical. Up to grade 8, preferably to grade 10, I think we shouldn't have any subject grades. We should have grades for standards plus narrative communication. There is no real need for a subject grade except for the last 2 years of high school. And so we should have, I think, GPA for two years at the most. The way we currently do GPAs, most commonly for 4 years, excuse me, is gender discrimination against boys, because boys are far more likely to be immature jerks in grade 9 and 10, but to be solid citizens and good students in grade 11 and grade 12. I think we need, this has shown us clearly that there are issues with the high school transcript. We need to really think about the high school transcript. And especially if you're not familiar with it, I would urge you to look at mastery.org, the transcript that's being proposed by the Mastery Transcript organization. And I think we've also recognized during this time the issues with competition, that class rank doesn't have much value, and that we should be reconsidering things like honor roll, academic prizes, and valedictorian. And the last one that I want to emphasize is the idea of hard and fast points where we determine grades during the school year, whether we call them quarters, terms, trimesters. This caused lots of problems in terms of how we were going to determine grades. Quarters, terms, trimesters really are only administrative and communication conveniences. Learning goes on over a whole year or over a whole course. And we need to be clear about that and make sure that grades aren't carved in stone at the end of a quarter, the end of a term, the end of a trimester. Now, what I've fairly deliberately done in this time that I had available is throw a lot of stuff at you. I've thrown lots of stuff at the wall. And I hope that what happens for everyone is that at least 2 or 3 of those things are highly relevant to you, that they stick for you. But everything that I've talked about very quickly are things that could and should be discussed probably at great length. And I would love to have the opportunity at some time to, in person or virtually, extend the conversation on some of these things with lots of educators. We've also, I think, recognized, or what's been recognized through this, is a quote that I really liked. If COVID-19 has taught us anything, it's that schools mean the world to their most important stakeholders, the students themselves. I think that one of the silver linings that has come out of this is that there is a much greater appreciation of teachers, both by students and by parents. And I hope that's something that will continue and that we can make use of, because it's really, really important to recognize.